Okay, welcome everybody. It's so amazing to have you all here at the Cape Jewish, no, not the Cape Jewish, Limmud and the South African Jewish Report event. I'm introducing Irwin, who, for those of you who don't know, I can't imagine that's possible. Irwin researches neglected aspects of South African Jewish history through the Kaplan Centre for Jewish Studies at UCT and the South African Jewish Museum. He will tell the story of a remarkable Jewish businessman called Isidore Schlesinger, the original Schlock Meister. Irwin is one of South Africa's most highly respected newspaper editors. He has a second career as a sought-after public speaker and offers insights into often overlooked aspects of our community history. Please go ahead, Irwin.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Let me try and share the screen. Is the screen visible?
Not yet. I can see you.
Okay, sorry. Am I up as a
You're a co-host.
co-host? Okay, sorry.
No worries. Let me just check. Yes, you're co-hosting, so you should be able to share your screen.
Let's try that again. No?
Not yet. I wonder, let me go and have a look quickly in security and see. Yep, you should be able to.
Okay. Sorry, I've got to share screen. Sorry.
Yes, you must share screen.
Sorry.
There we go.
All right. Apologies being stupid.
Not at all. I've been doing this all night. Sharing the wrong one.
All right. Just a second.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Let's begin. Okay. Now, if you were to take Donnie Gordon and add to him Raymond Ackerman and add to that Sol Kerzner and add to that Sammy Moore, you would get a rather irascible and somewhat fanatical man by the name of Isidore William Schlesinger. Sorry, is this showing side by side, or is it overlapping?
No, we can see you perfectly and your slide next to it.
Next to it, okay, because it's not behaving like that. Yeah, it's all right. So it's next to one another. All right. Apologies for the technical glitches. All right, let's get going. So chances are you've never heard of the man. He's largely forgotten. But in the first half of the 20th century, this man owned 90 businesses. He had 120,000 staff from here to Nairobi. He was also on the side the country's largest farmer. He had 1 million citrus trees, 77,000 sheep, and there was a lot more. And in fact, the man's achievements were so big that the only person to attempt a biography of the man died on the job. So I'm going to concentrate only on one aspect, how Schlesinger brought American mass culture, by which I mean American schlock, to South Africa, and in the process changed the culture of the entire country. So here is the great mystery. Schlesinger is only one of quite a number of Jewish immigrants who arrived in Johannesburg dirt poor around the turn of the century and in a single generation became prosperous, if not quite wealthy. Now, an anti-Semite would say, aha, the Jews always rise to the top thanks to cheating and sharp practices. And a Jew would say, not so, we were born with Yiddische Kops for business. But there is, in fact, a somewhat more mundane explanation, which is the Jews just happened to be the right people to arrive in the right place at the right time. The early 20th century was a period of great innovation. Mass consumer markets appeared for the first time. There were enough people, mainly white, but also some black, who were not very well off, but had enough spare cash to buy the cheaper goods. But the Anglo business elite weren't paying attention. Focused on Mother England, more snobbish even than their English cousins, the Anglo business elite focused on selling to their social peers and left South Africa's mass markets wide open. The people who first took notice were immigrant Jews. And the reason is because they were outsiders. It was second nature to them to look for opportunities way out on the margins in places where polite society would not deign to pay attention. And one of the best illustrations of this thesis is the business career of Isidore Schlesinger. So here it goes. 1894, a cherub-faced young fellow called Isidore Schlesinger, who looks as if he just had his bar mitzvah, but he was actually 23 years old, ran away from his home in New York, leaving his mother a note that he would not return until he was a millionaire. He headed across the world to the rough gold rush town of Johannesburg, founded just 8 years earlier. He found a job. A shop owner had bought a large consignment of a newfangled American invention, chewing gum. No one would buy it. South Africans could not be persuaded of the virtues of a rubbery substance which could not be swallowed and offered none of the usual benefits of food. Slesinger was told, if you can sell this, you can sell anything. The young man departed, laden with boxes of Beeman's, Peps and gum, and 2 weeks later, he had sold the lot. A precedent had been set in the course of a lifetime. Isidore William Schlesinger would become a multimillionaire by persuading reluctant South Africans to adopt American customs. He moved into insurance and became the most successful insurance salesman in South Africa, earning up to £15,000 a year in commission, a huge salary for the time. His only failure being a pitch to President Paul Kruger, who felt that at the age of 78, he was too old for life insurance. It's worth noting Schlesinger's sales technique. He did not try to sell insurance to the wealthy homes of Parktown. He toured the distant platteland from Boer Farm to Boer Farm, accompanied by a companion, a doctor. He and the doctor would stay overnight at the farm, and the doctor would provide free consultation to the entire family, who often hadn't seen a doctor for years. They would make a return visit a few weeks later, and only on the third visit, having made himself a firm favorite with the family, would Schlesinger raise the topic of life insurance. Now, after the Boer War, Schlesinger decided to go into business for himself. He started a property company and bought land at some distance from the city centre, establishing large parts of the suburbs of Orange Grove, Parkhurst, Parkmore. And then he allowed people to buy on installment. Now, this seems pretty obvious today, but was a major innovation then when property was sold cash up front. So Schlesinger's installment plan changed the shape of Johannesburg. It brought the property to the property market people who would never have imagined having the money to buy their own homes. The suburbs of Johannesburg ballooned rapidly northward, full of standalone houses with generous gardens built by people owning homes for the first time in their lives. Slesinger had already left his mark on Johannesburg, but it would not be the only one. Now, to the north of Parktown Ridge was a stretch of magnificent land which Schlesinger fell in love with. It belonged to a wealthy man by the name of Cook, who, despite many approaches from Schlesinger, refused to sell. Finally, Cook, trying to get rid of Schlesinger, made an outrageous demand of £60,000, which he assumed Schlesinger would turn down, but Schlesinger accepted it. All of Johannesburg thought Schlesinger had gone quite mad, buying a stretch of vacant land, not even a proper farm, and so far out of town for that price. We'll return later to the farm, which Schlesinger gave the name Killarney. Now, Schlesinger himself, who was a born and bred New Yorker, showed no great interest in moving into a house with a garden in the suburbs. He lived at the Carlton Hotel, which was Johannesburg's answer to the Mount Nelson, the preferred venue for high society parties and for touring British aristocracy, tycoons, government officials, etc. Less publicly known, the hotel belonged to the Joel family, relatives of Barney Bonato. In other words, Jews were owning things all over the show, but very discreetly. These were Jews who were just excluded from belonging to the rival Rand Club. Schlesinger rented an entire floor to himself, 18 rooms. He summons the barber at dawn to shave him. He held his first staff meeting shortly afterwards. He worked without pause until 9 p.m. when he had supper at the hotel's grill room. Then he retired to bed. He paid maddeningly close attention to the smallest details of his many businesses. He terrorized and humiliated his staff. He was sparing with compliments and was never ever known to have said thank you. He made no effort at all to socialize with the city's business or cultural elite. He was regularly squeezed for money by the city's Jewish causes, and he did give generously to the orphanage Arcadia and to the Jewish old age home in Sandringham, but he served on no community bodies. As an English-speaking American with Hungarian parents, he didn't have much in common with the Yiddish-speaking Litvak Jewish majority, and he never ever lived among them. Now, he might have spent his life in property and insurance, but in 1914, Barclays Bank made an offer that changed his trajectory. The bankers persuaded him to take over the city's oldest and best-loved entertainment theatre, the Empire Theatre, which, by the way, was also Jewish-run, and whose Jewish owners had in 1896 made it the first theatre in South Africa to show movies, flickering 30-second clips. Now, Schlesinger very quickly discovered that he bought into a total disaster. Most theatres around the country were in deep financial trouble. Anyone else would have bailed out, but instead of fleeing, Schlesinger bought them all out, the whole lot, all the theatres in the country. His idea was that one company would share the costs of the same variety acts across the country. He also bought up all the international rights to movies from abroad to be distributed exclusively to his theatres. Now, that was a very strange idea then, because movies were still silent and rather crude, considered mere amusement for children, and so it did not seem a very important step in the way it became. To make sure his movies were noticed, he's launched a popular illustrated magazine called Stage and Cinema, which in its day was the most popular magazine in the country. And to buttress his theatres more, he bought an advertising agency, and then he followed with another and another until he all but controlled the advertising industry. He introduced such innovations as billboard advertising and advertising in films. Thus, in an era of lax regulations, he'd become a monopolist. But since he seemed to be monopolizing businesses of absolutely no interest to the elites, no one paid much attention. And then, with the entire fledgling movie industry under his control, he decided to make his own movies. So in 1915, he built a sprawling movie studio on his farm, Killarney. 50 years later, but we're jumping ahead a little, his son would knock down the studio and replace it with the Killarney shopping mall. Now, an American director was imported, as were American and English actors, among them one Mabel Florence Ayling, stage name Mabel May, daughter of a waiter at an English inn. She played the lead female role in his first movie, which was about an artist who dreams of a beautiful girl who morphs from his imagination into reality, which is what happened. Mabel May starred in several more movies. She became Schlesinger's live-in mistress, starred in more movies, was the most frequent cover girl of stage and cinema. Finally, after living with him for 5 years, she persuaded him to marry her. But back to 1916, over in the USA, the movie director D.W. Griffith produced the first ambitious full-length feature film, epic in scale with a huge cast. The Griffith movie was called Birth of a Nation and was immediately controversial for glorifying the slave-owning South and the Ku Klux Klan. But that is not what impressed Schlesinger. What impressed Schlesinger was that it was far and away the most successful box office hit of the era. And so although his own studio was barely a year old, Schlesinger resolved to make a local version of Birth of a Nation on an equally grand scale. The Schlesinger film was to be called De Voortrekkers, and like the Griffith film, it would honor the defeated party in a recent bitter conflict. And much like the Griffith film, it was utterly oblivious to the racial stereotypes that it peddled. Now, the scriptwriter that Schlesinger chose was one Gustav Preller, a prominent Afrikaans writer and one of the first propagandists on behalf of rising Afrikaner nationalism. It was Preller who made the Great Trek, until then barely remembered as nothing more than a transport matter, into the central icon of Afrikaner history. He constructed an epic parallel to the biblical Israelites in search of the promised land. Now, according to the historian Isabel Hofmeyr, Schlesinger corresponded very closely with Preller as they worked through the logistics of what became an increasingly grand production. In short, Schlesinger didn't just own the movie business, he interfered in the details of how the movies were made in the most intimate fashion. So, for example, they discussed how would the Boers be dressed. Now, Preller knew perfectly well that they actually dressed in patched up assemblages of rags and animal hides, which became tattier and tattier the further they trekked. But this would not do in a movie celebrating Boer heroism. So instead, he concocted his own look of khaki and brocade waistcoats for the men and kappies and aprons for the women, all of them well washed and ironed, which would become the default standard for all subsequent depictions of the Boers to this day. The Voortrekkers was on an audacious scale never before attempted in South Africa and very seldom attempted since. Required incredible amounts of planning. An artificial river was constructed, as well as large numbers of ox wagons. 20 Zulu families, parents and children, were hired from Escort Natal and invited to build their traditional kraals on the empty fields of Killarney, which doubled as both film sets and living quarters. Since Schlesinger could not abide the thought of them being idle when not acting, they were obliged to also work as laborers, office cleaners, carpenters' assistants, and so-called tea-boys. Now, the great battle scene, the Battle of Blood River, had to be filmed on a single day. Some 3,000 black mine workers were hired to be the Zulus, and dozens of white miners to be the Boers. The Zulus, most of whom were not Zulu, very few of whom were likely to have ever seen a movie in those days, none of whom had been closely briefed in the sacraments of acting make-believe, were instructed to charge the Boer lager, wielding play assegais, and then at signal fall melodramatically to the ground dead. Despite repeated shouts from their indunas, the charging Zulus failed to fall dead. They continued charging the Boers, some of whom had loaded live ammunition into their rifles, and amidst shouts of "Skip die duivels," began firing. Mounted police had to intervene, forcing the Zulus back across the artificial river. In the end, one man was drowned and 122 were injured, 35 seriously enough to require urgent hospitalization. An exercise in fiction had turned into a second Battle of Blood River. An official investigation was held, and naturally for those days, all were exonerated. The film was finished in a great hurry, in time to be launched on the day of the Covenant, 16 December, a solemn holiday which Prelo himself had invented. The film was an instant box office success, with an average of 15,000 people seeing it each week. The Prime Minister, Louis Botha, was moved to tears, commending the tense dramatic interest and fine historic accuracy. Prelo himself had reason to be pleased. For all his decades of work, nothing matched this film for its impact on the public imagination. The people apparently imagine, so realistic are my representations as they sit in front of the screen like children, that they are seeing a real photographic reproduction of the actual events as they happened in 1838. 20 years later, the silent movies, when silent movies was considered absurdly antiquated, deaf voortrekkers were still pulling in huge crowds. Indeed, police had to be brought in to prevent a riot in Germiston in 1938 among throngs unable to get into showing. After that, some 43 more films followed over the next 6 years at the brisk rate of a new film every 6 weeks. A number of them had Afrikaans subtitles, a useful market sector that Hollywood was unable to reach. The success of De Voortrekker set a precedent for sentimentalized South African historical dramas, and a rush of more modestly scaled Zulu-themed sagas followed. For example, one in which a noble chief converts to Christianity and accepts white rule. And also one final real extravaganza in 1936, Die Bou van 'n Nasie, which covered the entire white history of South Africa from Jan van Riebeeck to Cecil John Rhodes, largely ignoring the existence of black people. So the question that this raises is, was Schlesinger in any way interested in promoting Afrikaner nationalism? And there seem to be two answers to that. One is that as an American, he had a certain antipathy to the English, and particularly to upper class English and their government, and a considerable admiration for the Boers, who he saw as plucky underdogs. The second was that he very shrewdly realized even then that Afrikaners would be seizing back the reins of political power, and it made sense to a smart businessman like him to keep on the right side of them. As to the politics of whites and blacks, he was little different to the rest of his white contemporaries. What would be regarded today as crude racism was the default position of the era. Now, Schlesinger's next remarkable contribution was radio broadcasting. It was he who transformed radio from a crude and primitive hobby, difficult to operate and of interest to only to slightly cranky enthusiasts, into a viable mass medium. So in 1927, there were 3 radio stations in the country with modest followings of a few thousand people each, one in Johannesburg, one in Cape Town, one in Durban. The technology was getting better. The snag was that no one could figure out how to make any money out of this. The driving force behind the Joburg station was once again a Jew, a Jewish doctor. In fact, Jews played a major role in the run-up of the radio broadcasting in South Africa. And Orenstein ran a radio station called Radio JB, which operated from the top of the Stutterfords building, 10 stories high, in the middle of town, on which he erected a large aerial. And Orenstein realized that the only man who possibly could solve the problem of making money out of radio was Schlesinger, and he went to see him. Schlesinger wasn't in the least bit interested. He'd never listened to radio and didn't want to. It was only after a trip to the US, in which he discovered that radio was the latest fad, that he changed his mind. Orenstein persuaded the Minister of Posts and Telegraphs to grant Schlesinger a license to take over all broadcasting in the country for the next 10 years, beginning on the not ideal date of April Fool's Day, 1927. Schlesinger established a company which he called the ABC, or African Broadcast Company, bought out all 3 radio stations, hired new staff, improved the quality, but for the next 2 years, he continued to lose money. He then tried to give the venture back to the government, and the government refused the offer. Now, in those days, anyone who wanted to listen to the radio had to buy a license for the post office for £2.05, which is quite a steep price. And naturally, hardly anyone bothered to pay. Schlesinger concocted an idea he called the Blue Free Voucher Scheme. The radio license fee would be built into the purchase price of the radio, and the name and address of the purchaser would be noted down so that they would be billed for the renewal the next year. The license fee would go to the African Broadcast Company, and the commission would be kicked back to the radio dealer as an incentive to ensure that people filled in the forms. There was, in short, absolutely nothing free about the Blue Free Voucher Scheme, but it caught on among the radio dealers and it became an immediate success. By 1936, Schlesinger had a 10-fold increase in the number of paid subscribers, and he was looking to putting higher power transmitters all the way across the country and even as far as neighboring Rhodesia. And in his grandest gesture of confidence, he bought an entire block on the eastern end of Commissioner Street, where in 1934, he built the 6-story broadcast house with 9 studios equipped with the latest expensive American machinery. Under the Schlesinger, broadcasting was shaped into a format that would last for decades and match what we understand today. There would be children's programs, soap operas, stock prices, sports coverage, interviews, quizzes, games, music from jazz to the classics, and time signals, a major innovation. Afrikaans programs were introduced. What broadcasting did was change white South African culture. A radiogram, as it was called, became a suburban status symbol, housed in an elaborately carved wooden cabinet and replacing the fireplace as the center point of the modern lounge. Staying at home at night to listen in silence to the radio became an acceptable form of entertainment. Now that Schlesinger demonstrated that radio could not only be self-sustaining, but was also a medium of great influence, the same politicians who only a few years earlier refused to have anything to do with radio now wanted to get their hands on it. Prime Minister Barry Hertzog very cunningly wrote to John Reith, who happened to be the founder of the BBC, the state-owned British company, for his opinion. Reith travelled to South Africa at his own expense, spent a month overseeing his own private commission of inquiry, went on a holiday to the Kruger Park, and then, most unsurprisingly, announced that South Africa would be best served by a state-owned broadcast system. In 1936, the Minister of Posts and Telegraphs announced that at the end of Schlesinger's license period, the state would take over his business. The minister betrayed some of his real motives during the speech, noting that it would be prudent in the country with, as he put it, a large native population for the state to control the medium as sensitive as broadcasting. He expressed admiration not only for the state broadcasting system instituted by the BBC, but also by Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. There was unanimous enthusiasm for this idea among persons otherwise strongly at loggerheads and scant praise for Schlesinger. Hints of anti-Semitism surfaced. One MP complained about the excessive price. Another MP did happen to point out that the price had not yet been determined, to which the first MP responded, "The honourable member must be a stranger in Jerusalem. Have you ever heard of Mr. Schlesinger selling anything for a low price?" In the end, Schlesinger was paid £150,000 for all his equipment and his buildings. Whether it was a fair price, Schlesinger, for reasons that will soon become apparent, chose for once not to quibble. And 6 months before his license period was up, the state took over his operation and his staff, immediately making one small change. The ABC became the SABC. Now, the lesson from radio broadcasting was this. Schlesinger could get away with monopolizing industries that had no great appeal to the Anglo and Afrikaner establishments. But if he stepped into an area which the establishment would come to consider its domain, he would run into trouble. And this would become even clearer with his next venture, which was into the newspaper business. Now, among the small crew of permanent residents living alongside Schlesinger at the Carlton Hotel was an eccentric journalist by the name of Arthur Barlow. Barlow had been a newspaper editor and a maverick politician, and he made it his business to know absolutely everyone who was of any importance in South Africa, and that happened to include his neighbor, Schlesinger. Barlow had a Jewish wife, Lily Nathan, who was the daughter of the owner of the Cecil Hotel in Bloemfontein and was Barlow's business brain. In 1934, she decided of her own accord that her husband ought to start his own newspaper. He wasn't that enthusiastic, but she went ahead and raised the money by passing a hat around the Carlton Hotel lounge, where she collected £2,000. The Barlows started a ramshackle newspaper they called the Sunday Express, with a tiny and underpaid staff, a number of them Jewish. Barlow was a master of political gossip and managed to annoy enough people to be noticed, and the circulation boomed. But as Mrs. Barlow discovered, annoyed people are disinclined to advertise. Lily persuaded her husband that the only way out of their dilemma was to bring in Schlesinger, and that took some effort. Schlesinger was worried that he would make enemies of rival newspaper editors, and these instincts would later prove correct. But in the end, a deal was struck. Schlesinger would be in sole charge of the business side, but Barlow could do as he pleased with editorial, with one exception. Barlow had to ensure that there was copious coverage of Schlesinger's movies, and all of it had to be positive. The only person who was unhappy was Mrs. Barlow. She feared that Schlesinger might sell the business from under her husband. Schlesinger did as he usually did. He took a small business and he made it enormous. He bought a building on the corner of Moy and Main Streets, and he installed a brand new American printing press, the best in the country, in the basement. He hired experienced staff from abroad. He also hired untried Jewish kids from the streets of Doornfontein, the first group of Jews to make an impact on Johannesburg journalism. These included Joel Mervis, who would be the future famous editor of the Sunday Times, Johnny Johnson, who would be the future infamous editor of the Sunday Express and the Citizen, and Cecil April, who was the founding editor of Golden City Post, which is today's City Press. Others to get their start from Schlesinger included the future Rand Daily Mail editor Lawrence Gandar and the legendary cartoonist Bob Connolly. Now, the newspaper business would prove tougher than the movies. This time around, Schlesinger was not pioneering virgin territory. He was treading on the toes of vested interests, in particular the mining companies, which owned almost the entire English language press, And those vested interests did not like having competition. The Central News Agency, or the CNA, also owned by the mining companies, which controlled the distribution of all newspapers in South Africa in that period, supposedly as a neutral vendor, refused to distribute the Sunday Express. And Reuters, the major international news wire, put under pressure, refused to sell to him under pressure from the Sunday Times. Slesinger was unfazed. He created his own distribution system. He outflanked the competition by buying a fleet of American Dodge motor cars to compete against the trains and bicycles used by his rivals. He had a certain fondness for aeroplanes. In fact, he had sponsored the first ever London to Cape Town air race, which was a complete disaster because all but one aeroplane crashed on the way from London to Cape Town. But here he used aeroplanes to distribute the newspapers, having parcels of newspapers dropped from low-flying planes as if they were bomb loads. He started his own news agency, Afrikaner, which soon grew large enough to challenge Reuters on African turf. One weekly newspaper was not enough for a man accustomed to thinking big. Schlesinger added another, the Sunday Tribune in Durban, which he followed by a morning daily, the Daily Tribune. And in December 1937, he launched the Daily Express in Johannesburg, a newspaper intended to take on the flagship of the mining newspapers, the Star. And it was this decision that was to prove a step too far for the competition. The Schlesinger-Barlow newspapers were a kind of amalgam of American-style populist journalism and its Fleet Street equivalent, shouting headlines, gossip, hyperbole, which fitted well with their huge personalities of both men. Schlesinger was also able to use his cinemas as distribution points for the newspapers and to leverage his power over the advertising industry, all of which enraged his competitors. Hurried efforts were made by the established press to improve the design and content of their own publications, which hadn't changed much since the Victorian era, and to hire a fleet of lorries for distribution to replace the much slower trains. According to Barlow, the racing of rival motorized distribution fleets through Johannesburg streets every night caused several accidents and at least one fatality. And yet the Daily Express lasted only 17 months. What went wrong? The reason given in those few histories of the South African press which mention the forgotten Schlesinger newspapers at all was that he lost too much money. But losing money to make money was what Schlesinger did. The real reason had to do with rising anti-Semitism. So as Milton Shane has demonstrated, anti-Semitism proliferated from the late 20s to the late 40s, powered by a rising Afrikaner nationalism. And despite Schlesinger's attempts to curry favor with Afrikaners, he himself became a useful target. So Shane describes a series of anti-Jewish speeches in early 1937 by the future Prime Minister D.F. Malan, a great anti-Semite, in which he accused Jews of depriving Afrikaners of their livelihoods, singling out Schlesinger in particular for his attacks. As Shane put it, Schlesinger was turned into a convenient symbol of international Jewish machinations. He reminded the Afrikaner of his alien and inferior place in the often abhorred capitalist order. Now, Schlesinger had now been in the insurance business for about 3 decades, but it was only after he moved into newspapers that his financial affairs suddenly came under media scrutiny. A professor of banking at the University of Pretoria wrote a paper criticizing the Schlesinger Group for placing its funds in Schlesinger organization equities. Although the practice was legal, it provided grounds for attacks in the press. And a British investigative journal by the name of Truth, which had become enthusiastic about Nazism and fascism, published some 22 articles accusing Schlesinger of running a pyramid scheme. Now, as Barlow pointed out, Truth a British newspaper with absolutely no presence in South Africa, was suddenly delivered regularly to the desks of prominent South African politicians and businessmen. A National Party MP, also with a soft spot for Germans, made repeated attacks on Schlesinger in Parliament, quoting at length from the Truth. The end came, according to Barlow, when a deputation arrived from the Jewish Board of Deputies, led by a prominent Cape Town community leader, Leo Kramer, to tell Schlesinger that his ownership of the newspapers was stirring up anti-Semitism and he should get rid of them. A few days later, without telling Barlow, Schlesinger began negotiations with his rivals, and as Mrs. Barlow predicted, he sold the company from under her husband. The new owners immediately closed the two daily newspapers, ridding themselves of their biggest threat to the industry, and the Rand Daily Mail and Sunday Times moved their staffs into Schlesinger's splendid new building and took over his brand new press. 4 months later, war broke out. South Africa joined the British side. The Nazi sympathizers in government fell speedily from grace. The public attacks on Schlesinger ceased. If he had held on just 4 months longer, everything might have been different. And he seemed to realize this himself. Barlow said that not too long afterwards, Schlesinger astonished him by saying, "Barlow, why did you let me sell those newspapers?" But to return to where we began with Schlesinger's property business. In 1925, having lived at the Kaplan Centre, Carlton Hotel for 17 years, he decided to buy it. He lost no time at all in changing almost everything, starting with bricking up many of the entrances because they were allowing too much theft, rebuilding the kitchens, hiring a new team of cooks from Europe. He wrote out a 100-page instruction manual by hand, which all the staff had to memorize. He added 3 stories to the top of the hotel, and the new rooms included such novelties as ensuite bathrooms and telephones. He put a swimming pool and a squash court in the basement. The sober Edwardian facade was replaced by colorful neon lights. He installed the first escalator in Johannesburg. On the street side, he opened the city's first fast food takeaway shop alongside an American-style drugstore. Both of those innovations, by the way, proved to be decades too far ahead of their time. And in front of the hotel, he donated to the city its first traffic light, or as they came to be known, robot. Now, the architectural historian Clive Chipkin has pointed out that Schlesinger completely refashioned the appearance of central Johannesburg. He took it from rather staid English Edwardian provincial to copycat Manhattan skyscrapers and glitz. Now, those of you who've been to the center of Johannesburg, not many do anymore, the major shopping and entertainment strip of Johannesburg in those days was Commissioner Street, and Schlesinger systematically brought it up from one end to the other, demolished everything there and rebuilt. In the Far East, his empire began with the Broadcast House, and in the Far West was His Majesty's, a combination of a kind of entertainment hub and an office block modeled on New York's Rockefeller Center. In between came the Carlton Hotel, the Metro, which was the largest cinema in the country with 3,000 seats, the Coliseum, the Empire, and much more. Now, it cannot be said that Schlesinger was ever a man of refined tastes, as architecture was to him an extension of marketing and showbiz. So he introduced a variant of the new American Art Deco style, very garish, ornate, and eclectic mix of pseudo-Egyptian, Byzantine, Renaissance, full of optical tricks, designed to thrill brick and plaster equivalent of a chromed American motor car. Outside, above the pavements, these buildings were hung with the latest New York innovation, which was neon lights, animated and flashing in multiple colors. Broadway brought to Johannesburg. Schlesinger basically had prefigured the architectural trickery of a later Jewish hotelier and showman, Sol Kerzner. Now, I don't even have time to begin to scrape the surface of Schlesinger's Americanization of South Africa. Women's fashions, women's makeup, junk food like cold drinks, ice cream and sweets, amusement parks, American-style kitchens, American-style home decor, all of these can be traced back to one man, Isidore Schlesinger. Now, having bought the Carlton Hotel and having refashioned it to his taste, Schlesinger moved out. In 1925, he built a three-story apartment block next to his movie studio in Killarney, where he installed his wife and son. The building was called Whitehall Court, still there today. It's one of the better addresses in Killarney. Once more, he took an entire floor. One of the rooms included a magnificent library, although Barlow remarked that he had never seen Schlesinger read a book. Around 1940, Schlesinger began to suffer from rheumatoid arthritis. It became more and more severe, leaving him in perpetual severe pain. He stayed night and day in Whitehall Court, holding all his meetings there. Finally, in March 1949, the arthritis killed him. He was buried on his enormous citrus farm in the northern Transvaal called Zebedela. Two rabbis had to travel 400 kilometers to conduct the funeral. Over the next 2 decades, the Schlesinger Empire, facing increasing competition from established interests, was slowly snipped and chipped apart. Today, nothing remains of it. The Killarney movie studio was replaced by the Killarney shopping mall. The Carlton Hotel was pulled down and replaced by Anglo-American's Kaplan Centre. The Colosseum, the Empire, His Majesty's, all great landmarks of Johannesburg in their day, are gone. The SABC abandoned Broadcast House and moved to Auckland Park. There are no statues of Schlesinger waiting to be pulled down. He has been all but forgotten. The question, of course, is what can we learn from the man's life? And perhaps this is what we can learn from him. What he did was he found opportunities way out in the margins. He thought very big so that he could spend, and he spent very big. He was willing to lose money to make money. But his great weakness was a one-man operation will not outlast the one man. And success breeds jealousy. The better you do, beware the wolves who come at the door. Thank you.
Thank you, Irwin. That was fascinating. I'm wondering if this man ever slept.
No, he didn't. He didn't.
Obviously not. We have a few interesting comments. There is, which I thought was fascinating. I'm just trying to see the chat here. Sorry. Veronica Belling said she came across him in her history of Yiddish theatre that he promoted on occasion. And Peter Acco, I hope I've said that right, said that the neon crown on the top of His Majesty's building, His Majesty's building, was made by Peter Acco's father at the company Claude Neon. So that's amazing that he was watching. Jeremy Wolf asked what happened to his son, John. In fact, quite a few people were interested in what happened to Schlesinger's son, John.
Okay. So Schlesinger, when Schlesinger dies, his son, John, is quite young. He's in his 20s. He's just served in the United States Air Force and comes back to South Africa. So he's quite inexperienced, but he nonetheless makes quite a go of the property section of the Schlesinger companies. He doesn't seem to be much interested in the rest. So it's John Schlesinger, who, for example, who actually develops Killarney. You can tell by looking at Killarney. Whitehall Court is very much older than every other building in Killarney. And he had far better taste than his father did. So he put up some really fine buildings. Killarney Hill, right at the top of 10th Avenue, was where he stayed, a beautiful building. And there's Killarney Park, which is right next to Whitehall, which is another beautiful building. He put up the Slesinger building in the center of town as one of the best skyscrapers it's in Braamfontein, beautiful building. Anglo Life and many others. So he really put up a lot of very fine buildings. He wasn't interested in the other stuff. He knocked down the studio. I think he moved the studios to Randburg, which is the reason why Randburg became a center of the film industry. And the thing carried on quite well until the mid-70s or 80s when he sold it lock, stock and barrel to Anglo American.
Wow.
And that basically was the end of the Schlesinger name, and he went to live abroad.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And then Dan asks, given that Schlesinger was a Jew, were any of his movies about Jews or Jewish themes?
Okay, well, what I left out of the talk for reasons of time was he had a news service, a documentary news service, in fact a prefigured television news. It was called African Mirror, and it was a weekly news thing that was screened at all the cinemas. Before you saw the main film, you saw African Mirror. And what was remarkable about African Mirror, which like many other Schlesinger operations was run largely by Jews, was how much Jewish stuff it covered. Almost every shul that opened in the country, every prominent Jew who arrived in the country, the opening of things like the Holocaust Memorial at West Park, all that kind of thing was covered by Schlesinger's African Mirror. Now, the tragedy of this is that all of that stuff is rotting away in an archive of the SABC, which is not being kept properly. And so there are now new efforts by the Jewish Museum and the Kaplan Centre to try and rescue that stuff from the SABC. And so anyone who's willing to help out on that, in fact, because it's an attempt to rescue Jewish history from oblivion, I think they'd be very happy to hear from you.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It seems like half of the people here, well, half are connected somehow to Schlesinger. Bernard Seif said, my father, Sidmore Engineering, built the structural work on His Majesty's crown. And then John Teager said his father, Dr. Arnold Teager, was his doctor, and our family knew him and Mabel and his son, who both outlived him by many years. So yeah, that's and I think that's all we have time for. But that was really fascinating and wonderful. I'm going to go and find out more myself. And thank you so much for being with us. And then if everybody would like to get back to the if anyone's still up for it, to get back to the central room, and you can see the wrap up with Wayne and Adina and Howard Saxteen. And then also we have a Limmud event coming up at the end of October. We'd love you all to be there. Please follow us on Facebook and on Instagram for any upcoming information. And if we can just show Irwin a round of applause by giving some jazz hands. Thank you so much, Irwin.
Thank you. Thanks
Have
very
a
much.
wonderful evening further.
Thank you.